so we are going to continue with the digestive system today. We've got, three more lectures. So we're really getting to the end of everything here. Before we start the continuing digestion, are there any questions about the stuff we covered on Tuesday? Because again, there's no warm-up since we have a quiz today. Is there any points of clarification or anything about specific immunity or cell-mediated versus antibody-mediated and all of that?
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
Interferons, are they just a warning for viral attacks?
Yeah. So those are things that if a cell is currently being fighting off a virus, it will release those molecules as a signal to their neighboring cells to kind of protect themselves.
But not like a bacterial attack, for instance.
No, it's about telling other cells to kind of shut down protein synthesis and things like that would make it harder for a virus to get a foothold. So it's totally about protection from viruses.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Okie dokie. All right, so we are going to be diving deeper into the digestive system. So, we introduced this briefly when we were talking about doing the pre-lab to the digestion lab. And like I was mentioning then, there's like two main functions going on here. One is going to be kind of breakdown of your food. And again, food is usually the bodies of other organisms. And whether it's a plant or an animal of some sort, that are made up of the same kind of molecules you're made up of, but put together in the form of the animal or the plant. So you need to disassemble that creature. And so that's this breakdown. And you want to basically bring it down into kind of the building block molecules. Right. Ultimately, you're going to want to get monosaccharides and amino acids and fatty acids and things like that. So then you can either reassemble them in your own form, or sometimes we break them down for energy. We'll talk about that in a few moments. Once you break down the food into these building block molecules, then you need to actually absorb them. Like all of this breakdown is officially occurring outside of your body. Your digestive tract is a tube running through you. We'll talk about that in more detail, but basically the breakdown is happening. In fact, I can just draw that right now. Like if this is you, here's your butt, there's your feet. When you swallow something and take it into your body, it goes into your mouth, down your esophagus. There's a stomach, there's a small intestine, there's a large intestine, ultimately your anus. And so the food that's coming in, it's coming in during all these different regions. It's getting broken down. Things that are ultimately going to end up being waste are coming out the back. And meanwhile, in this process, we're going to have to take the nutrients, the stuff we actually want to keep, take it across the wall of the GI tract and absorb it. So we're going to talk a bit about that. We've already seen that in the very beginning of the semester, like the transepithelial transport of glucose from the intestinal lumen, across the wall of the epithelium to be absorbed by the capillaries. So this whole thing here, this is called your GI tract, intestinal tract. Also called the alimentary canal. Right, so yeah, people talk about how we are basically topologically like a donut. We are, we've got this hole running through us from our mouth to our anus. And the food during the breakdown process is never actually inside your body. It's in this tunnel going through you. So we'll be spending a lot of time looking at how the different regions of this GI tract are specialized, from your oral cavity to your stomach, to your small intestine, to the colon, the large intestine. There are a variety of different specializations to break down different kinds of molecules or do different kinds of breakdown. We'll also talk about kind of, accessory organs, which are going to be like the glands, like your salivary glands that make saliva, your pancreas and your liver, bring down pancreas and liver that are going to be adding stuff into the small intestine, your teeth that help break down the food when it's in your oral cavity. So your digestive tract, when we think about the main organs, there's going to be, or the digestive system, I should say, is going to be this GI tract, which is the tube with all these specializations, as well as some accessory organs that add in lots of cool enzyme juices and things like that, and bile salts, as we've seen, to assist with that breakdown. So breakdown of food happening along inside that tube, but actually outside of your actual body. And then the other part's going to be the absorption, which is going to be bringing the nutrients across the walls of the GI tract so it can get ultimately into your bloodstream where you can actually use it for stuff. Probably worth, in a nutrition class, you go much more into detail about nutrients and what exactly are we getting from our food. But I think it's worth spending just a few moments talking a little bit about, what are we getting from the food we eat? So let's talk just, a real brief overview of what the heck are nutrients. We've met most of them already, carbohydrates, which we know are both essential for energy. Glucose is the core fuel for cellular respiration, but then carbohydrates also are structural components and all sorts of stuff. Proteins also major structural elements that we use to build all sorts of parts of our body. It's what makes up all of your, the fibers of your connective tissue and blah, blah, blah. Lipids are both structural, right? Like cholesterol and phospholipids that make up all your cell membranes, but also obviously you break up for energy. Fats are important energy sources. So all three of these are notable in that they can be broken down for energy. So these can be structural or can be disassembled and just used as fuel for ultimately making ATP for your body. The other nutrients would be, we call it minerals. Minerals is just like elements. It's like calcium and magnesium and phosphorus and anything that's on the periodic table is officially like one of the minerals in your diet. Obviously, you need these to both make things in your body like your bones, and they also are important as like cofactors helping enzymes do their job, or right, we iron was critical for making hemoglobin. So you could carry oxygen around. So you need to have a variety of these different elements to do these things in your body. Cobalt is another one. They're necessary for all these different processes. Then there's this idea of vitamins. Does anybody know what, we always use the word vitamins since we're like a little kid, like Applejack full of vitamins and minerals. Like, what is a vitamin? Anybody have a sense?
Well, I think it's usually something that, helps, say, an enzyme do its job better.
Yeah, so that is basically it. They are, and what we call
Can they not be synthesized in the body?
yeah, so those are the two kind of defining qualities. They are essential nutrients. Essential nutrients means that they must be acquired from the diet. As opposed to a lot of things your body needs that it can manufacture using the stuff it already has. And, used. So they're essential. They're usually organic molecules. And used as like coenzymes. So coenzymes are things that work together with the main protein in order to help the enzyme do its job. There's a lot of enzymes that they're not just made out of folded amino acids. They're the folded up amino acids that make up the protein part of the enzyme, but then there's this other piece that has to be part of it as well that makes the enzyme active. So vitamins are things that you get, they have to be acquired through your diet, and they are usually necessary to help the enzymes run all your different metabolic pathways. So that is kind of what we think about as vitamins. I think about things like, remember in cellular respiration, even like NAD and FAD, those electron carriers that were necessary to run cellular respiration. Those are derived from your B vitamins, like riboflavin and niacin are the things that you use to build build NAD and FAD. Yes, those things like that. So vitamins, this word essential, let me talk a little bit more about essential nutrients. So essential nutrients would be the vitamins. There are no essential carbohydrates. Any carbohydrate your body needs, it can make using other things it already has. Remember, we talked about gluconeogenesis. If you don't have any glucose, you can make glucose from other things. So there's no way to ever run out of carbohydrates because you can always make whatever carbohydrate you need. Protein is a different story. Proteins, there's somewhere, depending on who you trust, there's somewhere around 8 essential amino acids. There's 20 in all that are used to make the proteins in your body. And about, over half of them you can make using other stuff you already got. But there are 8 amino acids that if you don't have from your diet, you are not going to be able to build all the proteins you need. This is, we can go a little deeper into that. Like when you have a food, people talk about, a food being a complete protein. That is something that gives you all your essential amino acids. Typically things that are built on a floor plan a lot like our own bodies are the things that are going to be complete proteins. Like if you're eating another animal, right? If you're eating a cow, cows are basically like us, except with floppier ears and longer tails and walking off quadrupeds. But basically, if you disassemble a cow, you're going to have all the building blocks you need to reassemble a human. Other things like plants that are kind of more alien creatures, if you disassemble a plant completely, you actually don't have all the essential amino acids that you need to make a human. So we call those incomplete proteins. So does that mean that you can never have a healthy diet if you just eat plants? That's because of vegetarian?
Probably not. Can't you take supplements?
Right. Or there's actually there's another thing. What do you have to just be more careful of if you're being on a vegetarian diet, on a plant-based diet?
Iron?
No.
You're getting enough protein?
But so I'm saying let's focus on the amino acids here.
It's just getting a balance of all of the amino acids.
And how do you do that?
Eat different things that have different types in them.
Right. So that is, yeah. So even though, one plant doesn't have all the amino acids you need, and another plant doesn't have all the amino acids you need, they have different ones. So by mixing them up, they can complement each other and you can get everything you need. The old classic rice and beans kind of thing. Like we call them complementary proteins. Complementary proteins are if they're, one food A doesn't have everything you need, food B doesn't have all you need, but when you add them together, you do get everything you need. So you need to have them, they complement each other. What one is missing, the other can supply. You just have to be more intentional, right? If you want to just be more kind of like, I don't want to think about like it, you just eat another animal. But if you're eating plants, you have to be a little more intentional about making sure you mix it up so you get everything you need for making your, if you just eat wheat, you get this horrible version of malnutrition called kwashiorkor, where you can't make all your proteins. You don't make the plasma proteins that just keep the osmotic pressure balanced, and you have all the fluids leaving your plasma and going bloating out your body and stuff, right? So just eating wheat, even though you might be full and you might have lots of glucose for energy, you're still going to have horrible malnutrition because you're not going to have all the amino acids that you need. So just kind of putting that out there. So there are essential amino acids that you need to get from your diet. There are a couple of essential lipids as well. There's the alpha-linolenic, alpha-linoleic, like those omega-6, omega-4 fatty acids. So there's 2 essential fatty acids that you also need from your diet. Right, so when you're thinking about these things here, they can be broken down for energy, but they're also, some of them are essential to just make all the stuff you need to build in your body as well. So that's when we talk about nutrients. That's what we're getting. We're getting these things to make stuff. We're getting stuff for energy. We're getting things to help our enzymes function so we can run the metabolic pathways. Water is often also put in this list as another nutrient, obviously something you need to get from your diet to survive. So that is this whole idea of what in the heck, why do we have to eat? We're getting this stuff to do all this cool things to keep us alive. Okay, so what we're gonna do now is kind of get into detail of how we actually break down the food to get all those cool molecules we need. And then we'll talk about how we absorb it into our bodies. So again, we kind of draw. Starts basically in the mouth, in the oral cavity. This is where we start all of the breakdown. And again, we talked a little bit about this again in that pre-lab day, but there's two different things going on with breakdown. What are the two kinds of breakdown that are happening in the mouth as you start eating?
Mechanical and chemical?
Yeah, exactly. There's mechanical breakdown, where we're actually chewing, kind of rending the food into smaller pieces, increasing the surface area where we can actually have the enzymatic breakdown happening. But then, mechanical breakdown doesn't actually give you individual molecules. It just basically rips bigger food into smaller food. So the other thing we're going to need is the chemical breakdown. This is going to use enzymes to actually disassemble the larger macromolecules into those building block molecules. Right, in your mouth, we saw that was amylase, the salivary amylase that could start breaking apart the starch into shorter chains of simple sugars. So in the mouth, we have enzymes, salivary amylase in the mouth. And then it's just the very beginning though, like this salivary amylase. What's going to happen to that salivary amylase once it drops down into the super acidic environment of your stomach?
It become denatured.
It'll become denatured. We saw that in the lab. If you make things really acid, salivary amylase doesn't work anymore. So this is just the very beginning of starch breakdown in your mouth. When we get further down the digestive tract, down into the small intestine, there's going to be a bunch more amylases that are coming from the pancreas that will continue with the starch breakdown. So this is just the beginning of chemical breakdown in your mouth. If you chew on some starchy thing long enough, it will start getting sweeter in your mouth, but typically you're swallowing it. Like, in our lab, we let things incubate for a half an hour to watch the starch break down. You don't usually chew on something for a half an hour. So the majority of the starch breakdown is going to actually happen further down the digestive tract. And then we're going to swallow it, and it's going to go down the esophagus. We need to kind of talk a little more in detail about the layout of this GI tract. So let's give you some more kind of general layout of what this GI tract looks like. It's a tube. The inside of the tube we call the lumen. The lumen is the part where the food is, that is not officially inside your body. So that's where the breakdown is happening. Then there's going to be some epithelium. which is going to be the kind of lining. And it's part of what we call the mucosa, because it's a wet membrane that's epithelial based. So we're going to have to be pulling our food across this epithelium in order for the nutrients to actually absorb it. There's going to be a submucosa, which we're not going to talk about in that much detail. It's going to be made out of connective tissue with different glands and stuff in there, and it's blood vessels. What we are going to talk about are the muscles that help move things around in this GI tract. So there's going to be what we call the muscularis externa. And it's going to have two layers. There's a layer that is circular, that helps squeeze the tube more narrow. And then there's also going to be smooth muscle fibers that go along the length. We call the longitudinal layer. Oh, that better. So there are, I can do this. So there's a circular layer. Again, if you activate the circular layer, you're going to pinch the tube, squish the tube. This longitudinal layer of fibers, if you squeeze those, you're going to more pooch out the tube. You can activate these to do two main kinds of movements. So let's talk about those. The two main kind of movements in the GI tract. One is if you're trying to move things along. So this is like when you're swallowing something and it's in your back of your throat and you need to get it down to your stomach. You need to kind of just push it along. And that's peristalsis, which, and I'm sure this should not be brand new. I'm sure you've heard of peristalsis before. Basically, you've got your food here in the tube and you want to move it further down the tube. What you can do is contract the circular muscle above, relax the muscle below, and maybe pooch it out even. And that's going to start squishing the food down. So if we do like the time-lapse photography, it's now pushed down a little farther. So now at this point, we can actually contract above it here and relax below it. And in our time-lapse photography, it's going to end up being even a little lower now. So basically, you keep squishing above and relaxing below and just smooshing it along, right? So in your esophagus, when you're swallowing and you're moving the food from your throat down to your stomach, it's just basically pure peristalsis. Once you're in the stomach and the small intestine, and you start mixing the food up with all sorts of digestive juices, instead of moving things along, you want to kind of mix things up and kind of smush. It's kind of like a washing machine. Like, you have your laundry and the laundry soap, and now you've got to go and let the enzymes do their job, let the breakdown happen. So that pattern of muscular contraction is called segmentation. So segmentation would be, let's say we're in the small intestine, for instance, and I'll make the food different colors so it makes Makes more sense. So here's some food in their small intestine. And what we're going to do now, instead of pushing things along, where there's food, we'll squish. And then off to the side, we'll relax. And so now in my time-lapse photography, it's not really photography, my time-lapse drawing, you know, the green got squished here and here, the blue got squished here and here. And then you do it again, you squish where it's more bulgy, you're relaxing where it's not, and my little time-lapse drawing again. It's just starting to get more and more just mixed up. So you can, you know, it's kind of smush, 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 smush. Imagine you're holding a sausage and just squishing it back and forth. And so it's like that. So it's going to be mixing. So peristalsis, you know, is for propulsion, for moving things along, move it along. And segmentation is for mixing. You know, obviously you end up getting kind of mixes of it, right? Because ultimately, even the stuff that's in your intestines while you're mixing, you eventually are moving it along as well. So it goes down to the next part of the digestive tract. So it's not just pure, you know, in the esophagus, it's pure peristalsis. But in the rest of the digestive tract, you get kind of a, you know, kind of a mix of both kept going on. The other thing I'll mention about the GI tract before we kind of go into the specific areas is the idea of the enteric nervous system. So I'm talking about, it has the epithelium with this mucosa that's gonna, the lining that we're gonna have to pull our digested nutrients across. The muscularis externa with these different patterns of contraction that can either propel things along or mix things up. One of the things that's really kind of trippy about the digestive tract is that the control of the digestive tract is not just done by your CNS. You know, when we have been talking about the nervous system, we've usually had like, there's some kind of stimulus, the receptors, and there's integration, and usually the integration is happening in the brain and the spinal cord. In the GI tract, in your digestive system, you have what, you know, sometimes they call it like the primitive gut brain, the enteric nervous system. So let's talk about that. So get this out of the way. Actually, let me write this prettier. So the enteric nervous system are networks or plexuses of neurons that are within the walls of the GI tract that actually control a lot of the low-level digestive processes. There are going to be two main, we call plexuses. The plexus just means kind of network. There's going to be a submucosal plexus. You don't have to remember the terms. Submucosal plexus of Meissner, which is located in the submucosa. You can think of just these neurons that are in the submucosa here. There's going to be the Myenteric Plexus of Auerbach. I should have said plexus here. So Myenteric Plexus of Auerbach is actually these neurons that are located in between the longitudinal and circular layer of muscles in here. So these are these plexuses. These are like these kind of neural networks. You know, and they are going to have the ability to detect the conditions inside the system that are going to be useful. What do you think the kinds of receptors we're going to have for this enteric nervous system? What kind of things do we need to keep track of if we want to know the conditions and what to do next?
Chemoreceptors, we need to know if there's too much fat, not enough fat. There's all the things.
Chemoreceptors, you know, both for the substrates of digestion, right? Like I need to know, are there carbohydrates there, or are there lipids there, or are there proteins there? Because otherwise I don't know what kind of enzyme we need to break it down. For the products of digestion, you know, how do I know if I'm done breaking things down? You know, think about the enzyme, I mean, the digestion lab with the carbohydrates, where we had Lugol's to detect starch and Benedict's to detect the simpler sugars. You know, this is information you need to know, like what is there? Is it done breaking down? Do we need to keep mixing it up until we're done breaking it down? Right, so we're going to have chemoreceptors that can tell us. What other kind of chemoreceptors are going to be important that, you know, you can figure out from our lab? What else do you need to really track if you want to make sure your enzymes are working properly?
pH and temperature?
Yeah, pH. Yeah, temperature wouldn't be a chemoreceptor, right? Temperature is like a, you know, so I mean, that's going to be a whole other homeostatic thing. But pH, yeah, pH is going to be important. So you have receptors, chemoreceptors looking for the substrates and products of digestion, as well as the pH, and making appropriate responses. What kind of responses do you think you can have?
To take up that nutrient?
What are the kinds of active things that you think that this GI tract should be able to control, this or this enteric nervous system?
Well, it should be able to control pH to set it to.
It's going to be able, it should be able to, you know, control glands. Like we're going to see it's going to be able to turn on the pancreas to release bicarbonate juice. It's going to be able to turn on glands to release enzymes, right? Turn on your salivary glands. So we can have different secretions, mix different stuff up with the stuff going on in there. What other kinds of things do we need to control that we just talked about?
The mixing of food, like, does it need to be go through the spin cycle a few more times?
So the muscles, we can control that smooth muscle in the walls to move things around or mix things up. So the response, so we can control both secretion of stuff as well as movement of stuff. Well, I should have mentioned the receptors. There's chemoreceptors. What other kind of receptors do we have? What else is going to be useful to know about?
Pressure receptors?
Yeah, stretch receptors, exactly. Like how stretched out is this or that part of the tube? Right, so you have receptors that are telling you about the contents, about how stretched out the tube is. Then you have this neural network within the actual walls of the GI tract that can then respond appropriately by either triggering glandular secretion or muscular contraction. So a lot of things in the digestive tract happen just locally. If the whole reflex from stimulus to response is local, we call it a short reflex. So let me. So short reflex means that the stimulus came from the GI tract, the integration happened in the GI tract, the response is in the GI tract. Obviously your central nervous system can have an effect on your GI tract, right? We talked about, parasympathetic activation stimulating digestion or sympathetic inhibiting digestion. So your brain obviously can get in the mix. If the brain does get involved, then we call it a long reflex. So, right, so, I'm kind of spending a bit of time on this, but I think it's a really cool concept to think about, because we put so much energy into the brain being the integration, or the brain and spinal cord, the CNS, but your digestive tract has a lot of autonomy as well in terms of taking care of business. So, which is, it's just kind of, again, that's sometimes people call it like in the primitive gut brain, which is kind of fascinating when you think about it. It just, for me, it just makes the body even more kind of cool and weird. So now what we can do is go back here and talk about the specific regions and what's going on there and the different types of breakdown and absorption. So again, we've already kind of covered the mouth. Right, the mouth is where it all begins. We've got the mechanical breakdown of the teeth, some initial starch breakdown from saliva, salivary amylase, as well as we saw the mucus, right? The mucus kind of bound up your food into a slippery little ball to make it easier to swallow. The esophagus is almost pure peristalsis. Wait, I shouldn't say almost, it is pure peristalsis. So the esophagus is basically going to squeeze the food and drop it down into the stomach, right? It's happening as a process though. Like when you swallow, it takes maybe like 5, 6, 7 seconds for the food to get all the way down from your throat to your stomach, land in your stomach. It doesn't just get shot down there super fast. One of the labs that we didn't do, if we were in person, we would have used a little stethoscope, and you can put a stethoscope right near the entrance to your stomach and then swallow and set a timer. And you can set a timer on when you swallow, and about 5 seconds later, you hear this as the food actually enters into your stomach, right? So it takes about 5 seconds for this peristalsis to move the food down from your throat to your stomach. The beginning of swallowing, the official word for swallowing is deglutition. There's all these cool words. What's the official word for chewing?
Mastication.
Yeah, mastication is chewing. Deglutition is swallowing. Deglutition starts with voluntary muscles where you're kind of pushing the food to the back of your throat. But once you kind of stretch out the very top there, then this automatic, enteric nervous system takes over and then gets this peristalsis going, pushes it down. What happens? Sometimes the food gets stuck. It's like, and the wave continues down, but the food is still stuck. Right? People have probably felt this before. You swallow and then it's like, something's wrong. There's something still there. So what will happen is the system will initiate subsequent waves of peristalsis to kind of catch it and then continue bringing it down. So typically, if it all works fine, you swallow, it takes about 5 seconds to go from your throat to your stomach. If it gets stuck and the wave passes it by, it'll just initiate subsequent waves to catch it and carry it down to your stomach. Right, and the nice thing about having this, it's not gravity. Sometimes you think you're swallowing and it just falls down, but right, you could be lying on your chaise lounge and someone could be feeding you grapes and the food will still move, get squished along and end up in your stomach. You don't have to be vertical. So it's nice if you're getting fed grapes on a chaise lounge. Let's see. Right, the next part is going to be the stomach. We'll talk about the stomach in quite a bit of detail. That's where you have, the first parts of your protein digestion happening, as well as some other stuff we'll talk about in a few moments. Then you get down into the small intestine. The small intestine is where the majority of both breakdown and absorption occur. When we're in the stomach, there is some breakdown. There's some protein breakdown. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. There's some absorption. You can absorb water and some drugs and alcohol and things like that. But in general, it's not till you get to the small intestine where you really get down to business, breaking up the majority of your nutrients, as well as absorbing them and pulling them across into your bloodstream and into your body. Finally, you get like the colon or large intestine. One of the main things that happens in the colon is kind of reabsorbing water. Right, so during this whole process of breaking stuff down, you've been adding all these digestive juices, all these juices filled with enzymes and smushing, like I said, like kind of like a washing machine with the segmentation. But you've got this big slurpy goo. And if you just let that come out the other end, you're going to have diarrhea and you're going to get dehydrated. So in the colon or large intestine, you're pulling the water back into your body. We call, they say compact the feces. Now, you don't want to over compact the feces because then it doesn't move and you can't squeeze it out your anus and you've got constipation. So there is a balance there of keeping enough water in there that it's got a little bit of squishiness so you can get it out. But you want to pull most of the water back into your body or you're going to get dehydrated. It's actually, it's funny and not funny at all. I think it's like tens or more thousands of kids die a year just due to dehydration, due to uncontrolled diarrhea from different, cholera and dysentery and stuff like that. It's actually a really common reason for people to die is from diarrhea and over dehydrating. So it's really important that the colon is doing its thing. Yeah, diarrhea is not just kind of annoying or embarrassing. It can be fatal if you're getting dehydrated. So let's continue in following our food. We started in the mouth, we chewed it up. We did some mechanical breakdown, a little bit of enzymatic breakdown, and now we are going to go into the stomach. Whoops, where is it? There is it. All right, so here is the stomach. There are sphincters, circular muscles on either side. Cardiac sphincter is the one at the top. It can also be called the gastroesophageal sphincter. Gastro meaning stomach, esophageal, obviously esophagus. And the stomach has different sections. The top part is floppier, it's called the fundus. The bottom part is the pylorus. This is more muscular. The main part is called the body. When you first swallow your food, it doesn't immediately start getting broken down or anything. A big part of what the stomach does is act as a big storage tank. Right? You get to swallow a whole bunch of food. You were on Thanksgiving dinner and you probably ate all sorts of stuff, much more food coming in than your digestive tract could handle. So it gets stored in this fundus, this floppy. It basically, the food drops in and is just kind of sitting here piling up, waiting to get processed and squished and eventually making its way down into the lower parts of the digestive tract. You can store like up to a gallon, like 4 liters worth of food up in the stomach as you squish it up. Right? You've probably, at this point in your life, everybody has barfed, probably multiple times. Like when you first chew up some food and swallow it, and if you barf soon enough, you'll recognize the chewed up food you ate, right? When it lands in your stomach, it doesn't instantly dissolve or anything. You barf up a bunch of spaghetti, it looks like a bunch of chewed up spaghetti. You barf up a bunch of rice, it looks like a bunch of rice. But eventually what's going to happen is we start getting both mechanical and chemical breakdown occurring in the stomach. So the stomach has smooth muscle, and in fact, it has an extra layer. It has this we call oblique layer, where you have these kind of kneading, I'm going to say kneading, kind of if any, I don't know if people have made bread, when you're making bread, you kind of squish the dough and like this, and then you turn it around and you squish it again, and you turn it around and you squish it again, and you turn it around and you squish it again, and you turn it around and you squish it again. So the stomach is doing that. The stomach is smushing up and smushing down and smushing up and smushing down. So there's this kind of mechanical digestion there where it's just kneading and smushing and squishing and smushing and squishing. Meanwhile, we're also adding in the acids and pepsin that we saw in the lab. So this kneading is mechanical breakdown. But we're also going to be adding in HCl and pepsin, which is going to do protein breakdown. So in addition to storage, we're going to be starting with the breakdown of proteins on a chemical level, as well as more mechanical breakdown, basically turning what used to look like chewed up spaghetti into just mush. That mush they call chyme. Right? At some point, if you vomit and it's been a while since you've chewed up and swallowed it, it doesn't look like anything. It just looks like icky goo. That's chyme. Chyme is that goo as the food has turned from, into just kind of smushed up, partially digested goo.
Why is it that some foods don't get, like corn, for instance, like that don't get mushed?
So the corn, it's the inside of the corn does. The outside of the corn is made out of cellulose, which you can't digest. So if you don't have the enzymes to digest something, then it will just make it all the way through your system, without getting, if you've eaten polyseeds, I don't know if people sometimes can be, any time in your life you thought, oh, why take the shell off of my what do you call them? They're not polyseeds. That's what
Sunflower seeds?
What's that?
Sunflower seeds?
Sunflower seeds, yeah. If you chew up a bunch of sunflower seeds and just eat them shells and all, it can be a little painful when you're pooping, because actually the little wood of the shell is coming out as little splinters, right? Because it's cellulose, which is one of the main structural components of wood, does not get broken down by the enzymes in your body, so it can just travel through. We're going to talk about fiber is actually going to be important. If you don't have enough fiber in your diet, then your feces tends to get overly compacted and you get constipation. But the corn or the sunflower seed shells are examples of things that do not get broken down because you don't have the enzymes to break them down. So stomach doing some breakdown, and the stomach is breaking down protein, but again, it's going to continue having protein breakdown further down once we get into the small intestine. So, people who get their stomachs stapled to try to lose weight, or, stomach reduction, people will, kind of remove most of the stomach. You can still be digesting proteins because protein breakdown is going to continue down here. And it just means you don't have as much storage, which is the point of these stomach reductions, is you get full really fast. If you eat a little bit, you then have to just wait till that goes down to the next layers before you're ready to eat again, rather than just eat a bunch and get it all stored up and then let it continue to move down. So let's talk a little more about the walls of the stomach and what's important there. So this is supposed to be a cross section, and I'm going to draw things that you normally would only see under a microscope, but I'll draw them kind of big just for the interest of making it clear. there are all these things, they're called gastric pits with these gastric glands. And these gastric glands are making different stuff that gets secreted into the lumen of the stomach. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what these gastric glands make. So some of the glands in the some of the cells in the gastric glands are these parietal cells. They make hydrochloric acid. Again, the hydrochloric acid is important. We saw is actually part of your body defenses. You know, the food is going to drop into this really hyperacidic environment. It's usually around pH 2 in the stomach. Hydrochloric acid also helps denature the proteins, unfold them to make it easier for the pepsin to actually attack and break things down. So by denaturing the proteins and unfolding them, it will, you know, it's kind of like if you're in a little ball and someone's hacking at you with a knife, you might be safe, you might be hacked. But if you're like this and someone's hacking at you with a knife, your neck is all back, it's like, it's all over, right? So that's kind of what, you know, denaturing the proteins makes it easier for the enzyme, the pepsin, to actually go in and actually break those peptide bonds and free up the amino acids. Parietal cells also make this other thing called intrinsic factor. So intrinsic factor is necessary to absorb vitamin B12. You know, vitamin B12 is used for lots of important things. One of the things is necessary is actually to make red blood cells. Like if you don't have enough of B12, we talked about this, you know, as an aside, when we did the cardiovascular system, you can get pernicious anemia. Pernicious anemia is if you don't have enough B12 and aren't making your red blood cells well. One of the kind of non-intuitive things about the stomach is this is kind of one of the only essential things that the stomach does, right? If you don't have a stomach, or your stomach has been severely reduced due to one of these surgeries or something, you know, you don't need the storage because you just have to eat your food in little bits and let it percolate down. You don't need the protein breakdown from the pepsin because there's other enzymes in the small intestine that will break down proteins. But the one thing that is going to be a problem is without intrinsic factor and to absorb B12, you're going to need to get B12 shots in order to stay healthy. So that's one thing the gastric glands do. They make the HCl, they also make this intrinsic factor. There are also these chief cells. And they actually make what's called pepsinogen. Which is going to become pepsin. So let's talk about this idea of autodigestion. So you don't want this, right? So you are making all of these digestive juices that are designed basically to take a mammal a lot like you and dissolve it into individual molecules, right? Your digestive system is designed to take a cow and turn it into goo. So what is to prevent you from just digesting yourself from the inside, because you're made out of the same stuff as a cow. So how is it that we keep from just dissolving ourselves from the inside in this process?
Mucus.
So there's a few different things. One is the protective mucus layer that is going to be covering or lining the stomach as well as all the other lower parts of the digestive tract. So the place where the actual digestion and all of the corrosive enzymes are is actually separated from your actual wall of your stomach by this thick layer of mucus. So there's this mucus layer that's protecting your actual cells and tissues from the corrosive digestive juices. Another thing is the fact that the enzymes are actually not manufactured in an active form. So this is what we call like a little proenzyme. Right, so my little gland here, my chief cells here, they're making this pepsinogen. This pepsinogen is not active. It doesn't activate and actually turn into pepsin until it gets into the really low pH of the lumen of the stomach. Right, so by making the enzymes as these inactive proenzymes, that means you have them, you can transport them along ducts, like your pancreas is going to make all sorts of enzymes and transport them along little ducts to get into the small intestine, but they're all inactive enzymes. They don't actually activate until they hit the specialized pH of their destination. In the stomach is very acid compared to other places. In the small intestine, it's actually going to be alkaline compared to other places. But this idea of making enzymes in this inactive form that only activate when they hit the specialized pH of the lumen is a way you keep from digesting yourself. Right, that makes sense? And then the final thing is just there's really high cell turnover in your digestive tract. Your cells on the front line of the epithelium lining your stomach and your small intestines, they don't live very long. They are constantly, getting degraded by, even though there's these protective measures, you have to constantly recycle them. So you constantly have new epithelial cells migrating up from the pits and replacing the ones on the front line. So, in the stomach, they can migrate up the walls of these pits. In the intestines, they migrate up the pits of the crypts of Lieberkühn and get into the walls. But you constantly have new cells migrating from these protected little areas to replace these cells that are degrading, on the front lines of the lumen. And it's actually, it's pretty cool. I mean, let me look at that time. Let me try to do this. So most of your digestive tract is covered with simple columnar epithelium. So I'm trying to this is like from the side, it would look like this. From the top, it would look like just a bunch of cells here. As the cells wear out, let's say this dude here is ready to go. It actually gets like kind of popped out like a pimple. So here's the lumen where all the digestion is happening. This little thing gets squeezed up and ends up in the lumen. And all these other cells here just kind of tighten up using little contractile proteins and just, kind of block, kind of close the gap. And then this worn out cell just becomes another piece of meat that your digestive tract is digesting and recycling. So part of what you're digesting and recycling is, your own parts and pieces that are wearing out, which is kind of cool. So when we talk about ways to prevent autodigestion, again, you've got that thick layer of mucus that helps protect the cells that are lining the lumen. We're making the enzymes as these proenzymes, these inactive versions that only activate once they hit the specialized pH of the lumen, whether it's in the stomach or in the small intestine. And then ultimately there's this high cell turnover because the cells, even with these measures, wear out pretty fast. This is relevant like when people are taking like drugs for cancer, chemotherapy drugs. Most chemotherapy drugs work by targeting rapidly dividing cells. Like you're trying to find, cancer is tricky to treat, right? Because cancer cells are basically your own cells, except they've gone kind of crazy and they're dividing out of control. So how do you distinguish them from a normal body cell? One of the things you do is, target rapidly dividing cells because that's going to hit cancer cells, but it also triggers rapidly dividing cells in your body that you actually you wish you weren't hitting. Like your hair, the cells making your hair are rapidly dividing. So people lose their hair when they're doing chemotherapy drugs. Chemotherapy drugs also wreak havoc with your digestive tract because your digestive tract is also a place where you have a lot of rapidly dividing cells. So your digestive tract is going to be adversely affected by those drugs. So, it's worth thinking about this when you're wondering why is the digestive tract particularly vulnerable to those kind of treatments? Okay. Other things about the stomach. So the basic idea of the stomach, you've got these kneading up and down, smushing. Eventually, as the food turns into more and more just goo and no longer looks like what you ate, and the proteins are starting to break down, you start squirting the chyme down to the next level out, like a few mils at a time, out this pyloric sphincter. But we should talk a little bit about what happens if this really corrosive goo here ends up pushing its way up past the cardiac sphincter up into your esophagus. Right? Your esophagus is not designed to be protected. It's designed to just be a pipe that pushes food into your stomach. What happens if you have gastroesophageal reflux? Gastroesophageal reflux disease is when you have this digesting goo reflux go back up into the esophagus. What are you going to feel?
Pain.
Pain, right? That's heartburn. Heartburn because the walls of the esophagus are not protected from autodigestion, so they are getting burned and injured from this acidic goo that's coming up. It's called heartburn because the cardiac sphincter is right near your heart. So it feels like your heart is hurting, but it's actually your esophagus that's in pain. Other things that can happen if this protection breaks down is ulcers. Ulcers are where you start breaking down the walls and actually eating into the wall of it could be the stomach. You can have a gastric ulcer. You can have a duodenal ulcer if it's eating into the wall of the small intestine. You can have an esophageal ulcer if it's eating into the wall of the esophagus. So ulcers are where you actually start eating away at the wall of the GI tract, and that protection breaks down. Worst case, you can have perforating ulcers where you actually have a total hole through the wall of your stomach, which is kind of intense. One of the things that's kind of fascinating about ulcers that people figured out in the last few years is that people used to just think about ulcers coming from you're too stressed. You type A, you're getting an ulcer if you don't relax. But they've actually found that there is a microbial component to a lot of ulcers, that this bacteria called Helicobacter pylori this is a bacteria that is associated with the formation of ulcers, weakening the wall of the stomach. The dude who had the theory originally, people thought he was silly, and he brewed up a broth of H. pylori and drank it, and within days had multiple ulcers all over. So it was kind of suffering to kind of prove his point. So now, though, like ulcers are treated with antibiotics, because this bacteria is often a part of the problem. So this often is associated with ulcers. The one other thing before we leave the stomach. So I've talking about, well, actually two other things before we leave the stomach. There's not a lot of absorption going on in the stomach, but there's a little bit. So there's some absorption here. I wonder if maybe I should go to that other page in the stomach. I don't know, I'll stay here. Remember, I said most absorption happens in the small intestine, but for instance, water can cross the wall and get into your bloodstream in the stomach. You don't have to wait till the water gets down further down. You can swallow water and it gets into your body. Some drugs, aspirin, can get into your bloodstream across the walls of the stomach. Alcohol can get across, right? If you do some tequila shots after you finish your last final, you don't have to wait for the food to get down, or for that tequila shot to get down to your small intestine. You get a nice buzz like in a few minutes, probably, because it's coming across the walls of the stomach there. So it's not a major place of absorption, but there are things that do get absorbed there. The one other thing that the gastric glands have that we need to kind of bring in now. So we're making the acid, and pepsin for breakdown. We talked about intrinsic factor for absorbing B12. The gastric glands also have one other thing, which are called the enteroendocrine cells. So entero, anything that has the word entero means just having to do with the GI tract. Endocrine, we've mentioned endocrine. We introduced it with the idea of adrenaline or epinephrine. Again, what is a hormone? So these make hormones. What is a hormone?
It's a messenger that acts more globally, acts more systemically,
Exactly.
than locally.
So they usually get transported by the bloodstream and then talk to the cells that have they appropriate receptors. There's a particular hormone that they make, which is called gastrin, which is ultimately actually going to turn on the cells that make the acid and digestive juices in the stomach. So one of the things that's kind of interesting, like we're going to talk about the endocrine system in much more detail next week, but the endocrine system is really important in the control of digestion. We're going to see when we get down to the small intestine makes all sorts of hormones that are critical for the functioning of your digestive system. Even your stomach works by releasing this hormone called gastrin from these cells in the gastric pits, these enteroendocrine cells. They make this gastrin, and the gastrin is going to ultimately trigger other cells within the stomach to release the digestive juices. So this is kind of your first hormone that's going to be important in control of digestive processes. Let's talk about control of gastric secretion, and then we will take our break. So what is going to trigger the release of gastrin, which will then trigger the release of acids and pepsin and stuff?
Just eating food. I don't.
Right, so actually I'm going to go start. Aaron just said chewing. So even before the foods got down into your stomach, the idea of just thinking about food, so we call it the cephalic phase. Cephalic means your head. Just thinking about food starts this process. You know, it's kind of this feed forward thing, like you're ready, getting ready to eat. We know we're going to get the food dropping down there in a few moments. Why not just start the process now? So this would be like a feed forward kind of thing. You know, interestingly, this only seems to work if you actually have an appetite for the food you're about to eat. Like if they just put some like gruel or liver in front of you, eat your food, you know, this isn't going to work. But if you've got like a big bowl of pasta and you're all ready to dig in, you know, your stomach glands are going to be going before you actually take your first bite. Right? You've probably seen this as well with your salivary glands, right? If you think about, imagine eating a lemon, biting into a lemon and that weird, super sour tanginess in your mouth. And what would it be like to chew up that lemon? You're probably going to notice like you're getting more saliva in your mouth even before, like right now, I actually think about chewing on a lemon. I mean, it's happening to me. I'm thinking about it and my mouth is getting more and more kind of gloopy inside. I don't know if people notice that. Yeah, so cephalic phase. Next is what we call the gastric phase. This is when the food actually lands in your stomach. You know, stretch, you know, and presence, you know, of, you know, food. So there's the molecules that show up and the stretch of your stomach. That obviously is time to secrete digestive juices now, because there's obviously stuff there. And then there's going to be the intestinal phase. So this is kind of interesting. The intestine can send back inhibitory messages also via hormones saying, like, I'm not ready for more food yet. Please slow down your emptying. So again, if we go back to this picture here, you know, here's the start of the small intestine. let's say, especially if this happens, particularly like if you've had fatty foods that take longer to break down, the small intestine might still be working on the last stuff you squirted down. So it might be sending these inhibitory messages back saying, slow down. I need you to slow down here because we still need to take care of what you sent us already before more stuff comes down the pipeline. So that's what we call this like intestinal phase, where it's actually kind of sending messages back to control so you don't send too much if we're not done with what we've already got. So last we saw our food, it was in the stomach. And it was chyme. We talked about chyme is that word for the gooey goo of the partially digested food now that just looks like kind of white goo. And it's getting squirted out a few mils at a time down out the pyloric sphincter down into the duodenum. So the small intestine again, the word small intestine is small because of the diameter. It's like about 1 inch in diameter, but it's not small in terms of length. It's pretty long. It's like, 20 feet long. This big garden hose that's all coiled up inside your abdomen. And it starts with the duodenum. And the duodenum is kind of like a mixing zone. It's where we're getting the chyme coming in from the stomach. It's also where we're going to be getting the bile. We talked about the bile, which is necessary for fat breakdown, is going to be coming from the gallbladder. Bile is actually made in the liver, but it gets kind of stored and concentrated in the gallbladder. So, without a gallbladder, you're still like making some bile, but it's not there ready to go and squirt out and all that. So gallbladder is storing the bile, which is made in the liver. We'll talk about the liver a little more. The liver does all sorts of stuff. We've already met the liver as this thing which was recycling worn out red blood cells. And the liver was also making all the plasma proteins. Here, the liver is making bile. The liver, we're going to see the liver does so many different things. So there's a little bile duct, which is sending bile in here, joining in with the chyme in the duodenum. There's also going to be the pancreatic duct from the pancreas, which is also mixing stuff into the duodenum here. The pancreas, and we met the pancreas a little bit when we're talking about diabetes as a place that makes, insulin. Those are little pockets of cells. The islets of Langerhans are making the insulin. Most of the pancreas are these different kinds of cells, or acinar cells, which are making digestive juices. And there's two kinds of digestive juices the pancreas makes. One is a bicarbonate juice. Right, bicarbonate is going to neutralize acids. This chyme coming in from the stomach is really acidic. We've been mixing it up with hydrochloric acid. So the bicarbonate juice neutralizes the acid and actually takes it even alkaline. So the environment inside the small intestine is alkaline. So the bicarbonate juice is going to neutralize the acid and actually make the rest of the process an alkaline process. And two, the other thing that the pancreas makes is kind of an enzyme juice. And it has enzymes that break down pretty much anything you need to break down. Right, we already met pancreatin, which is a lipase. That was the one we were using in our lab. But it also has Pancreatic amylase. Like I said, starch breakdown continues and we get into the small intestine because there's amylase in this pancreatic juice. There are proteases, things that break down proteins. Back. Hold on, what just happened there? Protease. This one is called trypsin instead of pepsin. But trypsin is just like pepsin, but it's working in the small intestine in an alkaline environment. There are nucleases, things that break down nucleic acids. So basically, we have enzymes that are going to be able to break down whatever. And then where those actually are functioning are going to be in the next part, the duodenum, the jejunum. This is going to be the main site of breakdown and absorption. Then we get to the ileum, which is the far end. This one is more about reclaiming bile salts. So it's actually kind of cool. Basically, the bile salts get added in at the top where you have the gallbladder sending them in. And then when you get to the bottom, they get pulled back into the body and can get reused. So they kind of get dumped in at the top of the small intestine and reclaimed at the bottom of the small intestine, kind of like a fountain or something. I don't know. We'll get back to the jejunum in a few moments, but let's talk about the control of the secretion of the bile and the bicarbonate juice and the enzyme juice. When people were first studying the digestive system, they knew that when food got into the jejunum, that the pancreas and the gallbladder started doing their thing and secreting, but they didn't know what was controlling that. And I think these were in dogs, they would literally cut every physical connection, nerves and everything between the small intestine and the pancreas and the gallbladder. But the moment the food ended up in the small intestine, the pancreas and the gallbladder started secreting. So eventually they figured out that it was actually hormones. The small intestine releases hormones which travel through the bloodstream, which then talk to the pancreas and the liver. So let's, just like we talked about gastrin being released by the cells in the stomach to control gastric secretion, the small intestine is going to release two hormones that you should know. I'm going to give you two. There's more. There's more than these two, but these are the two that you're responsible for. One gets the kind of non-imaginative name of secretin. This is going to trigger the pancreas to secrete bicarbonate juice. What do you think is going to cause the small intestine to release secretin? What kind of conditions would warrant the request for bicarbonate juice from the pancreas?
Acidic.
Yeah, exactly. So this is going to be, released in response to low pH. So if the environment in the small intestine is acidic, it releases secretin, this hormone, which travels through the bloodstream, talks to cells in the pancreas, which then are going to deliver bicarbonate juice into the duodenum, into the top of the small intestine, and neutralize that acidity. The other hormone that you need to know, you just can call it CCK. Its official name is cholecystokinin. This triggers pancreas to release the enzyme juice. And also triggers the gallbladder to deliver bile. So this is going to both cause the gallbladder to contract and squish bile into the small intestine, as well as the pancreas to release all those enzymes and deliver those into the small intestine. What is going to be the thing that causes the release of CCK?
High lipid content.
Yeah, released in response, to lipids, and other nutrients. Because there's all the other kinds of enzymes as well. But so basically, when you've got like some substrates of digestion present there, that is going to be the signal that we need enzymes to break these down. So again, this idea, hormone, I think this is where people first actually started understanding that hormones are a thing. They're trying to figure out, how does the pancreas and the gallbladder know it's time to release their stuff? And they eventually realized it's these kind of little chemical signals traveling through the bloodstream rather than a direct connection. So that makes sense. Once we get into the small intestine, this is going to be easier just to show on a PowerPoint thing. I could draw it, but I wouldn't draw it as pretty and it would take longer. So one of the things about the small intestine is there's lots and lots of layers of folding. This is the small intestine. You've got these bigger folds, the plicae circularis. Then you've got you can see these things that look like little tiny fingers. They're called villi. Like when you actually look at a small intestine, if you're in anatomy and you open it up, it looks kind of like velvet. It doesn't look smooth. It's got all these tiny little fingers that are all reaching up and create incredible amounts of surface area. These are the little villi. So if you look at the surface, it's made up of tiny little fingers to increase the surface area like crazy. I want even more. Hey. Well, this does not have a good. And basically, each of the cells themselves has these microvilli, which are going to even increase. So each level of folding increased the surface area in here incredibly. So you end up having this crazy surface area. Like people talk about the size of a football field. If you smoothed out every little fold and stuff in the small intestine, instead of just this thing that looks so compact in your abdominal cavity, it would be the surface area of a football field. And that's going to really be helpful for absorbing nutrients, right? When we went back to the Fick's law of diffusion back in the day, we were talking about surface area is going to affect the rate of be able to pull things across the membrane. So by having a huge surface area, that's going to make it very efficient to pull stuff in across. Right, so this is kind of showing a villus has this little finger-like thing would be the villus. Let me get my annotator again. This would be like one of the villi, one of the little finger-like things. And then each of the individual little cells actually has this brush border, these microvilli, these tiny little folds. That transepithelial transport that we talked about back at the very beginning of school, right? This is like the lumen here. This is where the breakdown is happening. And we're going to be pulling the nutrients across these epithelial cells and absorbing them into the capillaries for most of the nutrients, or we'll see for the fats, we're going to have to put them into the lymph capillaries because the fats need a special way to move around, right? Because fats are not soluble in water. So we got something more complicated going on. So we're going to talk a little more about what's happening here in the villus, how the absorption happens. Most of the story you already know, the transepithelial transport, but taking the fats across the wall to absorb the fats is going to be a bit of a different story. This is showing this little crypt. This is where you have cells kind of waiting in the wings that can migrate up to replace things that are wearing out. Okay. So let's just assume, okay, so small intestine, a huge surface area. Let's talk about the absorption. So here's that villus, that little finger-like projection. Here's the lumen. Here's the capillary inside. Most of the absorption is just versions of transepithelial transport. Some mix and match of membrane transport proteins and active and passive transport that pull things across the cells that make up the epithelium. And move it into the bloodstream. So that's pretty straightforward. That should feel like super familiar at this point. That was like a major question on your first exam like a million months ago. Fats, though, are trickier. So let's talk briefly about how fats move around in general in the body. So obviously you can't just have fat dissolving in water. So they are always complexed as lipoproteins. Not always, but they're typically complexed. So typically carried lipoprotein is a combination of fat and protein. So you've got fat, which does not dissolve in water, but then you have protein that does. So it has a protein outer part and a lipid inner part. Lipid. So this thing can go into watery solutions and stay in solution and move around. So this is how we're going to move lipids around. There are three main kinds of lipoproteins you should know about. There's HDLs, high density lipoproteins. They get their name because they have a higher proportion of protein to fat. So they have protein weighs more, fat floats, right? There are LDLs, low density lipoproteins. These get their name because there's more proportion of fat to protein. So they're less dense. They're floatier. HDLs tend to be involved with removing fats and getting rid of them. LDLs tend to be involved more with depositing fats in your body, right? So when people talk about the good fats and the bad fats, you know, I'm going to say in quotes, good fat, you know, they're not good or bad. You need both. You'd have to deposit fats, you have to get rid of fats, but the ratio is something they look at for your overall health. There is like kind of this ideal ratio of adding fats into your body and getting rid of fats. And if you're too much on the side of these LDLs, that means you're kind of depositing more fat, and that's usually something concerning. So these are kind of typical ways that fats are being transported around in your body through your bloodstream as these HDLs, LDLs. The other lipoprotein that we need to just finish our story about absorbing fats into your body from your digestive tract, they get the weird name of chylomicrons. So I will I'll show you how chylomicrons do their thing. Basically, most absorption be transepithelial transport. So sugars, amino acids, things like that are just coming in through the normal ways that we've talked about. But fats are going to be different. Fats get broken down into, building blocks, fatty acids, glycerol and stuff. They're kind of surrounded by little bile salts. They get transported into the cell. But once they're in the cell, they get assembled into chylomicrons and spit out on the other side. So the fat breakdown products assembled into chylomicrons. So the fats are breaking down in here, or the products are getting taken up by this epithelial cell, which then creates these little lipoproteins, which can exist in water because they're little lipoproteins. But the problem is they're too big to directly cross into a capillary. So what happens? How do we actually eventually get them into the bloodstream if they can't actually cross a capillary and get into a capillary?
They go into lacteals, which bring them through the lymphatic system and just dump them out way up by your heart.
Exactly. So we have these lymph capillaries in there. They get the name lacteal because the fats dissolved in water look kind of milky. So lacteal, like milky. So the lymph capillary, we talked about how they have the epithelial cells that can open and bring in big stuff. So the chylomicrons can enter the lacteals. And then where do they go once they end up in a lymph capillary? Where do all roads lead to?
They all get dumped back into the general circulation, right? At the top.
Exactly. They all ultimately get dumped back, somewhere near the brachiocephalic vein. They get dumped back into your just venous circulation. So the lymph capillaries will eventually lead back into the closed circulatory system, but not directly. So, so fats are not going to end up actually going through the liver, right? They're actually taking a shortcut. Most of your other nutrients, where do your nutrients usually go first after they're absorbed by the capillaries in the small intestine?
Into the hepatic portal vein?
Yeah, exactly. They get drained into the hepatic portal vein, end up in the second capillary bed in the liver where things kind of get detoxified or modified and this and that. But the fats actually bypass that and kind of go straight into your bloodstream and avoid going through the liver. So when we think about the small intestine, again, there's the duodenum, kind of where you're kind of mixing. This is only like 10 inches long. This is where you're mixing the chyme, the digesting food, and the bile from the gallbladder, and the bicarbonate and the enzyme juices from the pancreas together. Then you get into the jejunum. Again, you've got lots of segmentation, smushing, mixing with all the digestive juices with your food. This is where you have most of the breakdown occurring, and also most of your absorption occurring. So the absorption either through transepithelial transport, like we've talked about, or for fats, you got to get more tricky and create these little lipoproteins, which dump into the lymph capillaries, which eventually do end up in your bloodstream. And then finally we got the ileum, where we reabsorb the bile salts. And finally, you end up in the large intestine or the colon. And actually, first for completeness, I'm realizing there's only a few more minutes here, so let's just finish the colon real quick. So after we've done the stomach and the small intestine, colon gets its name because it's pretty fat. It's got different areas. It's got the ascending, transverse, descending sigmoid colon. Finally gets to be the rectum, and then the internal anal sphincter, and the external anal sphincter. Like I said, it's mainly water reabsorption and balance. If you don't reabsorb most of those juices that have been mixed in, you are going to be in trouble. You're going to dehydrate. There are lots of bacteria in here. In fact, about half the volume of your poop is actually bacteria. It's not food waste. Those bacteria are actually helping, they can bacteria can make some vitamins. So the bacteria in there can make some vitamins. They can also break down some of the cellulose that you can't break down. And in that process, they make gas, flatulence. Part of what the rectum does separates flatus from feces. Right, it's got this kind of valve-like structure, so gas can escape without you having to lose feces, right? That would be a drag if you've got gas building up and there was no way to let it go without also spraying out poop, right? Avoiding, what somebody told me, the shark. You're able to let the gas escape without having the feces escape. And even if you've been eating food with more cellulose, you're going to have more, the classic beans, magical fruit. The more you eat, the more you toot, right? If you eat food where you're going to have more activity making more gas, you'll notice it more. But even normally, if you're not noticing it much, you're still making gas. Again, if the cellulose is also kind of what we call the fiber, you don't have the ability to break it down, and it helps provide like the bulk. So as the waste kind of moves along in here, you're pulling back water, but you don't want to pull back too much water or else it's stuck. That's constipation. So too much water reabsorption would be constipation. Worst case, you get what's called an impacted bowel. As a nurse, you might have to go in and actually chip out somebody's rear because it's so hardened and rock-like that nothing can pass anymore. The too little, though, like I said, is diarrhea. What else do I want to say here? Having enough bulk so the muscles can just move things along. If there's not enough bulk, the cellulose gives it bulk to keep it moving so you don't overabsorb. Also, it acts as a little bit to hold the water in to keep the poop from getting too dried out. Finally, let's just do this as the last thing here. Just like we saw with the urinary tract, we had an external urinary sphincter. There's an internal and external anal sphincter. As the feces fills up and starts stretching out the rectum more and more, there's going to be a spinal reflex triggering the relaxation of the internal anal sphincter. And now there's pressure further down and you've got the urge to defecate. It's like, ooh, I got to poop. But you have the voluntary skeletal muscle of the external anal sphincter, so you can choose whether or not this is an appropriate time to relax that one and let the feces leave your body. So any questions about that? Two more words that I think are just fun. These are, what is eructation? Right, so eructation is the fancy word for burping, just like deglutition is a fancy word for swallowing. When you have gas that's leaving your stomach, it's eructation. If you have, you have watery goo and gas in your intestines as things are smushing around, they make noise, gurgling noises. Those gurgling noises are called borborygmi. These are sounds from the GI tract, audible at a distance. you know, like basically when your stomach's growling or your stomach's going, right? So it's just kind of a fun word. Okay, dokie. Are there any questions?
I think Chin told us last semester that I don't remember if he told us or if I read it, but that when we were all growing up, we heard that the appendix is a vestigial organ, and lately people think of it more as like a bomb shelter kind of for the lower digestive tract in the case of like intestinal gut flora,
Right.
Armageddon. They all can go hide out in there and repopulate.
So yeah, so appendix, I didn't, in the interest of like trying to not just keep talking forever. Appendix is this little finger-like thing hanging off at the beginning of the large intestine, also called the vermiform appendix, which means worm-like. Yeah, and yeah, exactly. It's at this point, it's filled with a lot of lymphatic tissue, and they think that at this point that it probably plays a role in being like a reservoir, kind of like a seed bank to help repopulate your bacterial or the flora inside your intestine. In the interest of time, I'm not going into all the GI tract flora, which is doing all sorts of amazing stuff. Like if you don't have appropriate flora, your nervous system doesn't develop properly. You get all sorts of weird immune problems. The bacteria in there are definitely way more important than we ever imagined. But I am going to, maybe we'll talk about it later. I don't want to keep talking too much now, but the appendix, like if you get it cut out, it's going to be fine. Kind of like if you lose your spleen, you'll be fine. But there will be some functionality that would have been nice to have that you don't have anymore. What else? Yeah, the appendix. If you get infected though, and it bursts open, then you just spew bacteria all over the inside of your abdominal cavity, and that's really bad. So you don't want to have a burst appendix. Other things? Yeah, we'll talk a little more about the liver on Tuesday. I do want to bring the liver in, but I also want to like stop talking.